In December 1944, as Europe lay frozen in the depths of winter, the Second World War entered its sixth year, marked by staggering losses, bloodshed, and exhaustion. On the Western Front, following the successful Normandy landings in June, the Allies had pushed deep into France, liberated Paris, and gradually approached the German border. On the strategic map, everything seemed to tilt in their favor. The Americans, the British, and their allies believed that with one final push, Hitler's war machine would collapse. Yet in the closing days of 1944, Nazi Germany still refused to surrender. Instead, they clung to the hope of turning the tide through the boldest gamble they had ever attempted. This was the Ardennes offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, the last great battle in which Hitler staked all remaining hope to change his fate. Hitler and the German High Command knew they no longer had the means to fight a long war. German industry was being destroyed daily by American and British bombers, fuel was scarce, and manpower had been drained across multiple fronts. However, they still had several elite armored divisions, some stockpiled weapons, and above all, the desperation that pushed them to risk everything on one final throw of the dice. Hitler's plan was to unleash a massive thrust through the Ardennes forest, a rugged, heavily wooded region straddling the border of Belgium and Luxembourg, in order to split the Allied front, then drive straight to the port of Antwerp in Belgium. If Antwerp fell, the entire Allied logistical lifeline in Western Europe would be severed. American and British forces might be split apart, even forced to negotiate peace. Hitler believed that a spectacular victory could restore German morale and prevent the Allies from waging total war any further. It was a plan both reckless and daring, but also delusional, for it wagered everything Germany still had left. The Ardennes had already witnessed German surprise once before, in 1940, when panzer columns thundered through terrain the French had considered impassable. This time, Hitler hoped to repeat that feat. In reality, many German generals opposed the plan, arguing the army lacked the strength, but Hitler dismissed them all and ordered preparations to begin. He chose December deliberately. The poor weather, dense fog, and heavy clouds would ground Allied air power, the one domain where the Allies held overwhelming superiority. If successful, Germany could create a reverse Dunkirk, throwing the British and Americans into chaos. On the night of December 16, 1944, more than 200,000 German soldiers, backed by thousands of artillery pieces and tanks, suddenly opened fire along a front stretching over 130 kilometers. It was one of the greatest surprise attacks the Allies would ever face. The Americans on the front lines were caught completely off guard. They had believed the Ardennes sector to be quiet, a place where units could rest after months of brutal combat. Most of the divisions stationed there were either green troops with little combat experience or battered units recovering from losses. When German artillery thundered and waves of infantry and tanks surged through the mist, many American positions collapsed almost instantly. Within days, a huge bulge appeared in the Allied defensive line. That was the Bulge in the Battle of the Bulge. Columns of American prisoners were marched away, and numerous small towns fell into German hands. At one point, German spearheads advanced more than 80 kilometers into Belgium, stunning Eisenhower and Montgomery alike. Yet for the offensive to succeed, Germany needed to seize key transportation hubs. Chief among them was the town of Bastogne. Located in southern Belgium, Bastogne was not large, but it sat at the junction of 7 major roads. In modern warfare, whoever controlled such crossroads controlled the flow of supplies. If Bastogne fell to the Germans, they could easily funnel reinforcements, tanks, and fuel to their spearheads driving toward Antwerp. Conversely, if the Americans held Bastogne, the German advance would choke and stall. Both sides understood that Bastogne was a strategic keystone. Whoever held it held the key to the entire offensive. In the opening days, the Germans advanced rapidly, creating panic within the Allied ranks. But Eisenhower, the supreme commander, quickly recognized Bastogne's importance and ordered reinforcements to move in. The unit chosen was none other than the legendary 101st Airborne Division. The same paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, fought doggedly at Carentan, and endured the brutal battles of Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. Exhausted after months of combat, the 101st nonetheless set out once more, braving the bitter cold. They were rushed forward in trucks, crammed along narrow roads, while streams of Belgian refugees fled in the opposite direction. The sight of American paratroopers racing toward the front as civilians desperately fled painted a chaotic picture of that winter of 1944. On the night of December 18th, the first units of the 101st arrived in Bastogne, just hours before German armor completed the encirclement. They immediately dug in, fortifying positions around the town. Within days, Bastogne was completely surrounded. About 22,000 American troops were trapped, facing over 50,000 Germans with heavy artillery, Tigers, and Panzers. The Germans were confident the ring would soon crush the defenders. In truth, the Americans were desperately short of everything. Ammunition was running low, food supplies dwindled, winter clothing was scarce, and medical supplies nearly gone. Temperatures plunged below -20 degrees Celsius, frost and snow blanketed the Ardennes. Soldiers without winter coats wrapped themselves in scarves, blankets, even burlap sacks. Wounded men often lacked morphine for pain relief, many dying of exposure while waiting for treatment. Outside, German artillery rained down day and night, each blast tearing apart another corner of the small town. The Germans believed it was only a matter of days before the Americans would be forced to surrender. What Hitler and his generals did not anticipate was the iron will of the 101st Airborne. Though encircled, they had no intention of laying down their arms. Instead of despair, they clung to every street, every patch of forest, every frozen field. A defensive perimeter gradually took shape, forming a makeshift but stubborn fortress in the heart of the Ardennes. The people of Bastogne, the humble Belgian civilians, shared their wine cellars and loaves of bread with the Americans. They knew that if Bastogne fell, their entire land would be trampled under the boots of the Germans. In those freezing December days, Bastogne became more than just a town. It became a symbol of resistance. Bastogne was completely encircled on December 20th. In that small town, some 22,000 American troops of the 101st Airborne Division, together with elements of armored and artillery units, were squeezed into a defensive ring surrounded on all sides by an enemy force 2 or even 3 times their number. The German cordon closed like a tightening vice, pressing in amid the bitter cold of the Ardennes winter. The following days became a nightmare for both sides. For the Americans, it was hunger, frostbite, shortages, and unrelenting casualties. For the Germans, it was the astonishing stubbornness of an opponent who refused to collapse. Inside the town, conditions grew steadily worse. Roads were frozen over, snow blanketed everything, even local movement became difficult. The wounded were carried into church cellars, wine cellars, or any space that offered shelter. But medical supplies were nearly gone. Only a few ampules of morphine remained. Bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. Surgeons worked in dim candlelight, without electricity, without adequate tools, performing operations to the accompaniment of agonized screams. German shells fell ceaselessly, burning houses and sending black smoke billowing into the gray winter sky. American soldiers shared out the last tins of rations, some chewing on snow to trick their stomachs. Worse still, there were not enough winter uniforms. Many men wore only thin jackets or sweaters, wrapping themselves in blankets or burlap sacks. Frostbite and gangrene spread quickly. In the memory of many veterans, the fear of freezing to death was even worse than the fear of artillery. Yet the siege never broke their will. Defensive outposts of the 101st were scattered around Bastogne, clinging to woods, frozen fields, and crossroads. When the enemy came, they fought them off. When German tanks advanced, they stopped them with bazookas, anti-tank mines, even Molotov cocktails. In the early days of the siege, the Americans still had ammunition, but as time passed, the stockpiles dwindled. Every rifle round was cherished like gold. The 105mm howitzers fired only when absolutely necessary. Some units joked bitterly that they were trading mortar shells for thin soup just to maintain the illusion of being resupplied. In truth, Bastogne was barely holding on, waiting for relief. The Germans looked on with arrogant confidence. They believed only a few days were needed. The Americans trapped inside had no hope of escape or reinforcement. Surrender was the only option. On the morning of December 22nd, a delegation of German officers carrying a white flag approached the Bastogne lines. They were escorted inside to deliver an ultimatum. The letter stated plainly, the American forces were completely surrounded with no chance of relief. To avoid needless bloodshed, the American commander should surrender unconditionally. If he agreed, his men would be treated humanely under the Geneva Convention. If he refused, Bastogne would be annihilated by artillery and air power. The Americans had 2 hours to reply. The ultimatum was delivered to headquarters, where Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st, since General Maxwell Taylor was in the United States at a conference, now faced the most crucial decision of his career. When he finished reading the letter, silence fell over the staff. Then McAuliffe suddenly blurted out a single word: nuts. The room erupted in laughter. It perfectly captured what everyone felt. The offer of surrender was absurd, a bad joke. When the time came to send an official reply, McAuliffe hesitated, how to be both polite and firm. One of his officers suggested, "Why not just use what you said earlier?" And so the historic reply was written. To the German ultimatum, the Americans responded with just one word: nuts. The American messenger delivered it to the German delegation. The officers looked puzzled. They did not understand what nuts meant. Was it a code word, a slang term? When it was explained that it essentially meant, "Go to hell," their faces flushed with anger and embarrassment. They turned on their heels. From that moment, nuts became the immortal symbol of Bastogne's defiance. In the aftermath, German artillery fire intensified, as if to prove they had meant their threat. Infantry and tank assaults followed, probing the perimeter. But the paratroopers held fast. They erected wooden barricades, dug anti-tank ditches, and used the forest terrain to stage ambushes. Every village, every farmhouse became a strong point. German assaults often ended in disaster, stopped by grenades, machine gun fire, and unyielding resistance. A phrase circulated through the foxholes: "We're paratroopers, and paratroopers don't retreat." That stubborn motto rekindled hope in men shivering with cold and hunger. During those days, Bastogne was almost entirely cut off from the outside world. Communications were sporadic at best. Occasionally, American reconnaissance planes managed to pierce the clouds and drop sacks of bandages, morphine, or rations, but the amounts were pitifully small compared to the need. Meanwhile, the wounded filled the makeshift hospitals. Nurses and doctors worked themselves to exhaustion, amputating limbs without anesthetics, fighting to save lives in vain. Belgian civilians shared scraps of bread and potatoes with the soldiers, but hunger still reigned. As Christmas approached, there were no warm candles or carols, only the shriek of shells and the rumble of distant German tanks. And yet, in that darkest hour, an unlikely faith endured. McAuliffe constantly reassured his men. Reinforcements were coming, Patton was on the way, they only had to hold out a little longer. Those words spread across the perimeter, helping men suppress their hunger and cold to keep fighting. They knew that if Bastogne fell, the entire Ardennes front might collapse, but if they held, they would block Hitler's most critical thrust. The price would be thousands of lives, but the value of Bastogne was beyond a single town. On the German side, the Americans' defiance caused mounting frustration. They had expected Bastogne to fall on December 21st or 22, yet the 23rd and 24th passed, and the town still held. Tanks stalled for lack of fuel, artillery barrages failed to break the defense. The more the Germans attacked, the more time they lost. Every day brought them closer to defeat, for the Allies were steadily gathering strength to counterattack. What the Germans did not yet realize was that to the south, General George S. Patton had already swung his armies 90 degrees, marching at breakneck speed through snow and ice, with one goal, the relief of Bastogne. For many veterans, the days leading up to Christmas 1944 were true hell, and yet in that hell they discovered the unbreakable strength of comradeship. A man would share his last cigarette, his last piece of candy from home, or simply a handshake in the freezing dark. A whispered Merry Christmas in a candleless dugout beneath the howl of shells could warm the spirit. For the Americans in Bastogne, Christmas 1944 was the Christmas of defiance, and of the immortal reply, nuts. On December 23, 1944, after days of being smothered under a heavy fog, the skies over the Ardennes suddenly cleared. The rare winter sunlight gleamed across the glittering snow, and at that moment, both American and German soldiers realized the tide of the Bastogne battle was about to turn. For the shivering U.S. infantrymen crouched in a foxhole, the disappearance of the fog meant only one thing: the Allied air forces would return. For the Germans, however, clear skies were no blessing. Their entire plan, the surprise winter offensive, depended on grounding the American air armada beneath a blanket of ice and mist. Now, the element of surprise was evaporating, and a nightmare was about to descend upon them. That very morning, the familiar rumble of engines echoed in the distance. At first faint, it soon swelled into a thunderous roar. Black specks appeared on the horizon, growing larger with each passing second. Thousands of eyes in Bastogne turned skyward. They were C-47 Dakotas, the faithful workhorses of the U.S. Army Air Forces. That day alone, 241 C-47s took part in the mission, delivering hundreds of tons of life-saving supplies to the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. As the aircraft tilted their wings and dropped their cargo, the skies above Bastogne exploded with color. Thousands of parachutes blossomed, filling the heavens like giant flowers bursting into bloom in the midst of winter. On the ground, the GIs erupted with joy. They shouted, leapt from their foxholes, and embraced one another in sheer relief. Supply crates thudded into the snow and were seized instantly. Each parachute was color-coded: red for ammunition, blue for medical supplies, yellow for food, white for winter clothing, orange for fuel. After days of deprivation, Bastogne came alive again. Fresh ammunition fed the machine guns and set the 105mm howitzers thundering once more. Morphine vials kept dying men alive. Warm coats and boots saved soldiers from freezing on guard duty. K-ration boxes, canned meat, biscuits, instant coffee became an unexpected Christmas feast amid the frozen hell. Most precious of all, blood plasma delivered by gliders saved dozens of wounded who had been on the edge of death. One Army doctor later recalled that he had never seen blood become such a priceless Christmas gift. It wasn't only supplies that arrived. Glider pilots, flying unpowered craft, risked everything to land near Bastogne, bringing doctors, nurses, jeeps, even mortars. Many were hit by flak or crashed into snowy fields, but most succeeded. These men were considered among the bravest, for glider landings in combat were nearly suicidal, flying straight into flak-filled skies to crash land behind enemy lines. Their sacrifices only deepened the defenders' determination. The surrounded soldiers knew that an entire nation was straining to keep them alive. Their duty was simple: hold on, one more day at a time. While the Americans rejoiced, German soldiers outside the ring of steel stood in stunned silence. Watching the sky fill with parachutes, they grasped what it meant. Their siege was doomed. The entire German plan hinged on the assumption that the Americans inside Bastogne would run out of supplies and surrender. Now the Americans proved they could be resupplied even under siege, something the Germans themselves had failed to accomplish. The bitter memory of Stalingrad in 1942 came rushing back to many German officers. Back then, Paulus's 6th Army had been promised an airlift by the Luftwaffe. But it was a disaster. Only a fraction of the needed supplies ever arrived, and the entire army was annihilated. Now the Americans were doing what Germany could not. One German officer later admitted, "We realized then that we were not fighting just an army, but an entire industrial giant." Indeed, the Bastogne resupply operation was a living demonstration of America's logistical might. Within days, hundreds of tons of cargo had been delivered. In the Christmas week alone, more than 1,100 tons were dropped. Ammunition, fuel, rations, medicine, clothing. It was an organizational and technical feat. 241 C-47s flying in formation, on time, to the exact coordinates, releasing their loads precisely over a tiny besieged area. Coordination between pilots, navigators, and reconnaissance teams had to be flawless. Despite heavy flak, most aircraft returned safely. One pilot later confessed that seeing American soldiers waving in jubilation below made him feel as though he were part of a miracle. The psychological effect was immeasurable. To the Americans, each falling crate was proof they were not forgotten. The message was clear. We're still in this fight. That Christmas Eve in 1944, in the surrounded town, small parties broke out as units shared newly dropped rations. The hymn "Silent Night" floated into the cold air, mingling with the whine of artillery shells, creating a moment at once tragic and sacred. For the Germans, those colorful parachutes carried not only supplies, but a stark message. America could sustain its armies anywhere, anytime. Their morale cracked, for the industrial war was already beyond their means to resist. With fresh supplies, the defenders of Bastogne fought with renewed ferocity. No longer conserving bullets, they poured fire into every German assault. On December 25th, the Germans launched their largest attack yet, 18 tanks with supporting infantry, hoping to break through. But with replenished ammunition, the Americans held the line, destroying all the tanks and turning the assault into a disaster. German soldiers began to believe Bastogne was impregnable. American soldiers believed relief was imminent. And indeed, just after Christmas, Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through from the south, shattering the siege. Bastogne was saved, yet its immortal legend had already been sealed the moment the first parachutes blossomed in the skies on December 23rd. On the morning of December 25, 1944, as Christmas carols still echoed faintly in Bastogne's dugouts, the Germans launched a desperate assault. For them, time was running out. Hitler's grand Battle of the Ardennes was meant to alter the course of the war, but delays were turning it into a losing gamble. If Bastogne was not captured before American reinforcements arrived, the entire offensive would collapse. Thus, on the most sacred holiday of the West, Bastogne became the stage for the fiercest battle of the siege. At first light, 18 Panzer V's and Tigers, supported by hundreds of infantry, surged forward, striking hard at the northwest sector, the lines held by U.S. paratroopers. The grinding of tank treads on frozen snow echoed like thunder, accompanied by the pounding of German artillery, as though to crush the town itself. But the Americans were no longer the depleted force of earlier days. With fresh supplies from the airlift, their artillery opened up in unison. 105mm howitzers thundered in barrage. 57mm anti-tank guns hidden in snowbanks fired at point-blank range, while infantry bazookas flared, forcing even heavy Tigers to lurch and stall. Within hours, the assault was broken. German tanks burned across the fields, black hulks littering the white snow. Their infantry, leaving wrecks behind, withdrew in disorder, abandoning a battlefield of ruin at the very gates of Bastogne. For the Americans, that Christmas Day victory carried immense spiritual weight. They had repelled the strongest enemy attack during the holiest of days. Many called it a Christmas gift from God. Even as gunfire still echoed, survivors shared canned meat, crackers, and coffee from the airdropped rations. Some units lit small candles in bunkers, softly singing Silent Night against the backdrop of distant shellfire. An army doctor later recalled, "That night, Bastogne was a strange mixture of hell and heaven. The dead lay beside the living, but nothing could extinguish the spirit." Meanwhile, beyond the siege, another force was racing toward Bastogne with unprecedented speed, George S. Patton's Third Army. Just days earlier, Patton had pivoted his entire army 90 degrees northward, a feat of maneuver considered extraordinary in military history. In 3 days, he drove 3 armored and infantry divisions over frozen, treacherous roads to relieve Bastogne. The pace astonished both Germans and Allies alike. Many Allied officers had doubted that an entire army could shift so quickly under such brutal winter conditions. But Patton achieved it, thanks to American discipline and his own decisive command. On December 26th, the spearhead of Patton's 4th Armored Division reached the southern approaches to Bastogne. Their advance was grueling. Tanks slid off icy roads and had to be winched back, while German flak and infantry harassed them constantly. Yet the cry of "Relieve Bastogne at all costs" drove them forward kilometer by kilometer. By afternoon, elements of the 37th Tank Battalion broke through at the village of Bastogne, just a few miles from the town. There they encountered a group of exhausted American defenders pushing outward. The two groups clasped hands in the snow, voices ringing with shouts of, "We made it!" a moment that became the living symbol of Bastogne's endurance. When the news reached the town that Patton's men had opened a corridor, Bastogne erupted. Paratroopers who had steeled themselves to fight to the last bullet wept openly with relief. They were no longer alone. Ammunition, food, and reinforcements would pour in. After 7 brutal days of encirclement, Bastogne was officially relieved. In his diary, one soldier wrote simply, "We survived. Bastogne will never kneel." For the Germans, Bastogne's failure was a mortal blow. Without capturing the town, Hitler's thrust toward Antwerp collapsed. Instead of splitting the Allies, they became bogged down in a small but unbreakable fortress. General Heinz Guderian, architect of Germany AS Armored Forces, later admitted, "We lost our last chance to change the war ES course." After Bastogne, Germany would never again mount a strategic offensive in the West. From then on, they could only retreat in despair, resisting step by step until Berlin fell months later. Yet Bastogne is remembered not only for its ferocity, but also for its symbolism. When America received the Christmas news that the 101st Airborne still holds, the nation swelled with pride. Newspapers blazed with the single word, "Nuts," General McAuliffe's defiant reply to the German surrender demand. That terse response became the very embodiment of American spirit, steadfast, mocking, unyielding. Even President Roosevelt cited Bastogne in his address, hailing it as proof of freedom's strength against tyranny. The relief also highlighted America's vast logistical and industrial might. In mere days, thousands of trucks, tanks, and aircraft had been mobilized to save a single small town in the Ardennes. This was more than a victory of tactics or morale. It was the triumph of a full war economy, where Detroit S factories and Texas S oil fields contributed as much as the riflemen in the snow. Bastogne thus stood as proof that the United States could project overwhelming power to any point on the map, and that this strength ensured ultimate victory. After the battle, Bastogne was left a shattered ruin. Over 3,000 Americans were killed or wounded in the siege, and thousands of civilians suffered grievously. But the spiritual legacy endured. Veterans of the 101st would later say, "Bastogne was where we came of age." It was the place they learned that, so long as they had comrades and faith, no ordeal was insurmountable. After Patton's corridor was opened and Bastogne was officially freed from encirclement, the battle quickly transcended mere military significance to become a spiritual symbol. From a small town hidden in the frozen Ardennes, Bastogne entered history as one of the decisive turning points of World War II. The event not only shaped the outcome of the Ardennes campaign, but also gave America an enduring emblem of indomitable will. Strategically, Bastogne was the choke point of Hitler's entire plan. Without controlling the town, the Germans could not sustain their fuel and supply corridor to reach Antwerp. The stubborn resistance of the 101st Airborne slowed the German timetable and squandered their only golden opportunity. Once Bastogne held, the German thrust was split, losing momentum and surprise. The Allies had time to redeploy, bring in air power once the skies cleared, and launch a full counterattack. Bastogne thus became the lock that broke the back of the Ardennes offensive, shattering Hitler's dream into smoke. Yet what made Bastogne immortal was not strategy alone, but its spiritual impact. As news of the siege reached the United States, the nation followed each day with bated breath. Americans listened to radios, read newspapers, and prayed for the young men trapped in the freezing woods. Then came General Anthony McAuliffe's legendary reply to the German surrender ultimatum, just a single word: nuts. Short, humorous, yet defiant, it exploded across the home front. That one word became the battle cry of a people, a reminder that freedom never bows to violence. Major newspapers like the New York Times and Time magazine blazoned headlines: "Bastogne still holds." During Christmas 1944, when countless American families worried for sons overseas, the news became the greatest gift of all. It showed that their boys were not only fighting, but fighting heroically, etching history with their endurance. That spirit spread across the country, forging political and social unity to pour everything into the war until ultimate victory. For the Germans, Bastogne was a devastating psychological blow. Many still believed the Ardennes was their last chance, that the miracle of 1940 in France might be repeated. But when a small town held by an understrength division stood firm against a massive mechanized force, that belief collapsed. They began to see the brutal truth. Germany no longer had the strength to face America's industrial might and fighting spirit. After Bastogne, the Wehrmacht increasingly fought in desperate defense, while the Allies advanced with overwhelming confidence. Another layer of Bastogne's symbolism lay in the Band of Brothers spirit, the unbreakable camaraderie among the 101st paratroopers. In the darkest days, they shared single cigarettes, scraps of rations, even drops of water. They endured the bitter cold, the terrifying shelling, and the grief of comrades falling beside them. Many veterans later said that only in Bastogne did they fully understand the meaning of brotherhood. Decades later, when the series Band of Brothers brought Bastogne to screens worldwide, millions were moved by that same story of sacrifice, loyalty, and human connection. Logistically and industrially, Bastogne was the clearest proof of American power. The resupply mission by 241 C-47 Dakotas showed that America could turn the impossible into reality. While Germany failed to resupply Stalingrad, the U.S. succeeded in feeding and arming an entire besieged division in the depths of a winter forest. It proved that modern war was not only decided on the battlefield, but also in factories, fuel depots, and production lines. Bastogne thus became a symbol not just of bravery, but of national organization and strength. After the war, Bastogne was preserved in America's collective memory as one of its brightest chapters. In 1949, the Mardassin Memorial was built in Bastogne to honor the sacrifice of U.S. soldiers. Tens of thousands of veterans and American visitors returned to remember fallen comrades. Local civilians recalled those harrowing days of 1944, hiding in cellars, hearing the thunder of guns, watching American parachutes fill the sky like angels. To them, the GIs were not just soldiers, but liberators who brought life back from despair. The historical meaning of Bastogne reached far beyond World War II. It became a lesson for later generations that in the darkest moments, resilience and faith can shift the tide. Bastogne showed the world that a surrounded unit, with willpower and strong support from the rear, could halt an entire offensive. It was proof that history sometimes turns not on distant headquarters decisions, but on freezing soldiers in snowbound foxholes refusing to surrender. For Americans, Bastogne remains a symbol of national character in war. Unpretentious but steadfast, unyielding even in direst circumstances, always believing collective strength would bring victory. These lessons are still taught in the U.S. military today. At West Point, cadets study Bastogne as a textbook case of spirit, tactics, and logistics combined. On an international level, Bastogne also sent a powerful message about the meaning of freedom. Those soldiers fought not only for survival, but for a greater ideal, that the world could not be devoured by totalitarian violence. They stood firm not just from discipline, but from the conviction that behind them stood their families, their nation, their democratic civilization. That belief turned Bastogne into a timeless symbol, not just for America, but for the entire free world. Today, when people speak of Bastogne, they do not think of a single battle. They think of a spirit, the spirit of nuts, of holding fast, of defying fate even in the harshest siege. Bastogne has become legend, for it showed that in war, the most important weapon is not tanks or numbers, but the unbreakable will of human beings. In December 1944, Bastogne was just a small, little-known town in the Ardennes. But when the guns fell silent, the snow melted and the war came to an end, the name Bastogne had risen far beyond the map of Belgium to become a global legend. It became synonymous with ideas such as resilience, defiance, and the will to win. Bastogne was no longer merely a place. It had transformed into an immortal symbol in the collective memory of America and the free world. What made Bastogne unique was the combination of three forces: the power of human spirit, the power of logistics, and the power of symbolism. First came the power of human spirit. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, most barely in their 20s, turned Bastogne into an impregnable fortress. They endured sub-zero cold, hunger, and the lack of medical supplies. They watched their comrades fall day after day, but their morale never collapsed. When General McAuliffe uttered his defiant word, "nuts," that reply was not just his alone, it was the shared voice of thousands who had decided, "We will not surrender." Their spirit proved that sometimes willpower can compensate for every material shortfall. Next came the power of logistics. Bastogne was living proof that in modern war, whoever controls the supply chain holds the key to victory. The 241 C-47 Dakotas turned the skies above Bastogne into a lifeline, proving America's ability to sustain combat power anywhere. Without those miraculous supply drops, Bastogne might have fallen. It was not only weapons, but also America's industrial and logistical strength that made it the world's leading superpower after the war. Bastogne, therefore, became both a military lesson and an economic-political lesson for the world. Finally, Bastogne embodied the power of symbolism. Not every battlefield triumph leaves a lasting mark. Bastogne did because it contained all the drama: a desperate siege, brutal winter, an enemy many times stronger, and the extraordinary resilience of young soldiers. Its story reached across America during Christmas, the holiest season in Western culture, making it even more poignant and unforgettable. Images of shivering soldiers singing Silent Night in the snow, or the defiant one-word reply, "nuts," etched themselves into millions of minds. Bastogne thus transcended a battle to become a spiritual legend. Looking back, Bastogne taught humanity several enduring lessons. First, that in war, brotherhood is an unmatched source of strength. It was the paratroopers' bond as brothers that kept them standing through every ordeal. Second, that modern war is decided not only by bullets, but also by the power of the rear, industry, transport, and organization. Third, that symbols of spirit can be as powerful as victories in the field. A single short reply like "nuts" could inspire a whole nation and shake the enemy's confidence. Today, when visitors come to Bastogne, they see not only rebuilt houses, but also museums, monuments, and plaques bearing the names of the American units that fought there. Locals still recall those terrifying nights when their town burned under fire, but also the American parachutes descending like gifts from the sky. Every Christmas, Bastogne becomes a place of pilgrimage for veterans, descendants, and all who wish to understand the price of freedom. For America, Bastogne remains proof that national strength lies not in ease, but in the ability to overcome the harshest trials. It is a symbol still used by the U.S. Army to remind new generations, whether in Iraq, Afghanistan, or any future battlefield, the lesson of Bastogne holds true. Stand firm, trust your comrades, and never surrender. More broadly, Bastogne carries a timeless message. Freedom always has a price, sometimes written in blood, snow, and the sacrifice of ordinary men. The American soldiers of 1944 were no supermen. They were young men, many who had barely begun to live their youth. Yet in a single fateful moment, they made history. They proved that anyone, when guided by ideals and brotherhood, can achieve greatness. Thus, Bastogne will never be remembered as just a battle. It is an immortal symbol, the symbol of resilience, of the power of logistics, and of the spirit of freedom. In the icy Ardennes winter of 1944, Bastogne inscribed a chapter that will never fade. The chapter of ordinary men with extraordinary will who stood firm against violence and, through sacrifice, kept hope alive for the free world.